Montana Territory, early spring of 1876. Snow still clung to the shaded folds of the low hills, but the prairie grass was greening in patches, bending under the push of a cold wind that had not yet learned it was April. The stagecoach rattled along a narrow track cut through open land, its wheels creaking with every rut. 6 passengers rode inside, shoulders pressed close. A miner with soot in his beard, a pair of sisters headed north, a quiet man in a wool coat, a young couple whispering in the corner, and Clara Whitford. Clara sat near the window, hands wrapped tight around the leather strap that hung above her seat. She was 23, tall for a woman, with hair the color of wet chestnuts wound neatly into a knot at the back of her head. Her dress was plain calico, the hem already darkened from weeks of travel. She had a small satchel at her feet and a slim-handled knife tucked into her boot, not for show, but because she'd learned there were times a woman might need it. The driver's shout broke the steady clatter of hooves. The right front wheel jolted into a rut and cracked with a sound like splitting firewood. The coach lurched sharply to one side, throwing everyone against the far wall. The younger sister cried out. The miner cursed under his breath. Clara braced her arm against the window frame and stayed upright until the coach skidded to a halt in the ditch. Horses tossed their heads, nostrils steaming in the cool air. The driver jumped down, hat pulled low against the wind, and began trying to calm the team. Clara stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The sky stretched wide and pale overhead, empty of everything but a thin scatter of clouds drifting east. In every direction lay miles of prairie, no fence lines, no smoke from a homestead chimney, no sign of Cedar Bluff. "Half a day yet," the driver muttered as he examined the broken wheel, "and we won't be making it without a smith's tools." Clara's heart sank. She had left everything behind in Kansas for this, a position promised at the boarding house in Cedar Bluff, and now the road had given way beneath her. She took a slow breath and pulled her shawl tighter. A voice came from behind, steady and deep. "You all right there, miss?" She turned quickly, her fingers brushing the hilt of the knife in her boot. A man on horseback had reined in just beyond the ditch. He looked to be around 30, with sun-browned skin and a lean build. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his eyes, but when he spoke again, they were clear and gray as river stone. "I'm Elias Boone," he said, "coming back from a drive east of here. Saw your wheel give out." Clara measured him in silence for a moment. He carried a Winchester in the saddle scabbard, and the leather of his vest was worn smooth at the seams. There was dust on his boots, and a patience in the way he waited for her to answer. "I'm fine," she said at last. "Town's a ways off. You won't make it before night on foot," Elias said. "I've walked farther," she replied, folding her arms. He gave a short nod, unbothered. "All the same, it's safer to ride. My horse can carry 2. The driver, still muttering over the wheel, glanced up. "Best take him up on it, miss. Night wind out here's no friend." Clara hesitated. She had learned to trust slowly, if at all. But something in the man's manner, the calm, the lack of urgency in his tone, set her a little at ease. "Fine," she said, "but I carry a knife." Elias's mouth curved faintly, not quite a smile. "Means you're smart?" He nudged the horse closer and shifted in the saddle to offer her a hand. The leather was warm beneath her palm as he helped her up behind him. She settled stiffly, one arm gripping her satchel, the other braced on the saddle horn. The horse stepped up onto the track again, hooves striking the hard ground in a slow, steady rhythm. Wind tugged at the brim of her bonnet as they rode west, the sun lowering toward the blue-shadowed hills. Far ahead, a darker line was rising along the horizon, a wall of cloud that promised more than just nightfall. The wall of cloud was closer now, its underside the color of slate, with flashes of pale light trembling deep inside. The wind sharpened, carrying the smell of wet earth before the first drop ever fell. Elias glanced over his shoulder. Storm's moving fast. Cedar Bluff's still a good 2 hours from here. Clara tightened her grip on the saddle horn. Then we'd better keep moving. We could, he said evenly, and ride straight into the worst of it. Or we could head for my place. It's half the distance, and there's a roof over it. She hesitated. A cabin meant walls, warmth, but also meant trusting a stranger with more than just the space behind a saddle. The wind gusted hard enough to sting her cheek with grit. Somewhere behind them, thunder rolled like a slow drum. "All right," she said, her voice clipped. Elias turned the horse south, toward a low rise dotted with the black skeletons of winter-dead trees. They rode without speaking, the silence broken only by the creak of leather and the distant rumble of the storm. The prairie rolled away behind them, and soon the outline of a small cabin appeared at the base of a bluff, a thread of chimney smoke bending in the wind. By the time they reached the door, the first sheet of rain swept over them. Elias swung down, tied the reins to the post, and offered his hand again. Clara took it without comment, her boots landing solidly on the wet ground. "Inside," he said, lifting the latch. The cabin was a single room, but clean. A wood stove stood in one corner, already radiating gentle heat. Against the far wall was a narrow bed neatly made, a folded quilt at its foot. Shelves held tin cups, a few plates, and jars of dried beans and coffee. "You can put your things there," Elias said, nodding toward a chair near the stove. "I'll take the bench tonight." Clara set her satchel down, unsure if she was relieved or unsettled by the quiet certainty in his tone. She held her hands toward the stove, letting the warmth sink into her fingers. Elias hung his rifle on a peg and began to busy himself at a small cupboard. "Dried venison and biscuits," he said. "Not much, but it'll keep the chill off." "I've had worse," she replied, watching as he poured water into a dented pot. He moved without wasted motion, as if every step had been repeated 100 times. When the pot began to steam, Elias ladled the food into 2 tin bowls and set one before her on the small table. "You've come a long way," he said, not as a question, but as an observation. "Far enough," Clara answered. She took a slow spoonful, letting the heat drive away the last of the wind's bite. Before he picked up his own spoon, Elias bowed his head briefly. "Thank you, Lord, for the roof over us and the food before us. Amen." Clara glanced up, caught off guard. It had been months since she'd heard a man speak grace without ceremony or show. They ate in companionable silence, the sound of rain pattering on the roof filling the space between them. From time to time, the wind rattled the shutters, but the fire in the stove held steady. When they had finished, Elias gathered the bowls and set them in a small basin. "Storm should pass by morning," he said. "You'll be in town before midday." Clara rose from the table and crossed to the window. Outside, the world was a blur of gray rain, the bluff disappearing into the downpour. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel the urge to keep moving. "Thank you," she said quietly, still looking out. Elias paused in the act of stoking the fire. "For what?" "For not making this more than it is," she said. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Just making sure you get where you're going, Miss Whitford, that's all." She turned back to the window, letting the warmth at her back remind her that for tonight, at least, she was safe. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The morning broke clear and cold, the kind of clean air that followed a hard rain. Clara woke to the sound of a kettle rattling faintly on the stove. Elias was already up, rolling the sleeves of his work shirt as he poured steam and coffee into 2 tin mugs. "Mornin'," he said, handing one across the table. She accepted it, the heat seeping into her chilled fingers. "Thank you." "Storm's gone. Roads'll be muddy in places, but passable." He nodded toward the door. "If you're still bound for Cedar Bluff, we can be there before noon." Clara took a sip, the coffee bitter but strong. "That's where I'm headed." They saddled the horse without hurry, the earth damp and dark beneath their boots. When she mounted behind him, Clara felt the same unfamiliar steadiness she had the night before. Not safety in the usual sense, but something close enough to make her uneasy about losing it too soon. By late morning, the land began to show signs of settlement. A split rail fence here, smoke curling above a stand of cottonwoods there. They crossed a shallow creek and followed the road into Cedar Bluff. The town was small, 2 rows of weathered buildings facing each other across a dusty main street. A hitchin' rail ran the length of the boardwalk in front of the general store, the livery, and a saloon with its doors propped open to the warmin' day. Elias reined in near a 2-story clapboard house with a wide front porch. Its white paint had peeled in the wind, but the steps were swept clean. A wooden sign above the door read Caraway House. "This is it," Clara said quietly. Elias swung down and tied the reins, then offered his hand. She slid to the ground, adjusting her skirt. "Mrs. Ada Caraway runs the place," Elias told her. "She's fair, but she's got no time for talk that bends the truth." "I can speak plain," Clara replied. "I figured." He hesitated, eyes steady on hers. "I'll leave you to it then." "You're not coming in?" "This part's yours," he said simply. She gave a small nod. "Thank you for the ride and the roof." He touched the brim of his hat in reply, then stepped back as she climbed the porch. She could feel his gaze until she reached the door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of soap and hearth smoke. A tall, straight-backed woman in a dark dress stood behind the desk near the stairs. Her hair was drawn into a bun tight enough to hold through a windstorm, and her eyes missed nothing. "You're the girl from Kansas," she said, her voice even. "Yes, ma'am, Clara Whitford." "You looking for work?" "I was told you had need for someone who could handle linens and keep to the rules." Mrs. Caraway studied her a moment longer, then said, "We'll see. You can start with the sheets upstairs. Second room on the right's empty." "Yes, ma'am." Clara didn't ask about wages or hours. She simply set her satchel on the floor, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. By the time the church bell rang noon, her arms ached from wringing sheets, but she'd kept pace with the washtub. When she passed the front window, she glanced outside. Elias Boone was gone, the main street empty but for a wagon trundling past the livery. Clara turned back to her work without sigh or smile. She'd made it to Cedar Bluff. What came next was hers to shape. The days at Caraway House fell into a steady rhythm. Morning chores began before sunrise, collecting firewood from the lean-to, heating water in the copper tub, scrubbing floors until the boards showed their pale grain beneath the soap. Miss Ada Caraway moved through the hallways with the same calm precision each day, her skirts whispering against the floorboards, her eyes sharp for missed corners or wrinkled linens. Clara kept her head down and her hands busy. She'd worked in harsher places, where raised voices and thrown crockery were common, so the quiet efficiency here suited her. Mrs. Caraway spoke little beyond giving instructions, but Clara noticed that when the work was done right the first time, there was the faintest easing in the woman's shoulders. Meals were taken in the kitchen with the other girls, 2 younger women who split their time between serving boarders and cleaning rooms. Conversation was light, mostly about the comings and goings in town. Clara contributed when she had something worth saying, otherwise she listened, storing away small bits of local knowledge. The storekeeper's habit of shorting sugar sacks by a handful, the way the postmaster's wife hung a lamp in the window when her husband was away. After a week, Mrs. Caraway handed her the key to the linen closet. "Keep it locked," she said. "Things walk off when they're left loose." Clara slipped the key into her apron pocket without a word, understanding that this was trust given in the only way Mrs. Caraway knew how. Her first Sunday in Cedar Bluff dawned crisp and clear. The church bell began tolling early, the sound carrying over the rooftops and across the thin layer of frost still clinging to the grass.
Clara dressed in her plainest clean dress and walked the short distance down Main Street. The church was a modest wooden building, its steeple simple but well kept. Inside, the benches were filled with townsfolk in their Sunday best. Men with fresh-shaved faces, women with hats trimmed in ribbons or dried flowers. A faint smell of pine soap lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of coal smoke from the stove at the back. Clara chose a seat near the middle, neither in the front where every face could see hers, nor in the back where whispers sometimes gathered. When the minister stepped to the pulpit, his voice was gentle but sure. He spoke about the parable of the mustard seed, how even the smallest beginning, with care and patience, could grow into shelter and strength.
Her eyes drifted to the narrow windows, where the pale morning light slanted across the pews. She thought of the broken wheel on the open prairie, the long ride through wind and rain, and the cabin with a fire already going. For the first time since she'd left Kansas, a sense of calm settled in her chest. After the service, Mrs. Carraway was waiting by the door. "You keep to the truth with the Lord as well as with me," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied. The older woman gave a single nod before stepping out into the street. That afternoon, Clara returned to the boarding house and resumed her chores. She didn't speak of the sermon to anyone, but as she folded sheets and hung them in the sun to dry, the words about the mustard seed stayed with her. Perhaps Cedar Bluff could be such a place, a small beginning, growing into something worth keeping. 3 weeks passed before Clara saw Elias Boone again. The morning was warm for early May, the kind that hinted at summer's dust yet to come. Clara had been sent to the mercantile for lamp oil, flour, and a few bolts of thread Mrs. Carraway had ordered. The store was busy, 2 freighters collecting supplies for the trail, a mother keeping a sharp hand on her boy's collar as he reached for a tin of candy. Clara waited her turn at the counter, the list folded neatly in her hand. When she finally stepped forward, she caught sight of him through the open doorway. Elias stood by the hitching rail, speaking with the blacksmith. A coil of rope hung over one shoulder, his hat pushed back just enough for the sun to catch in his hair. He didn't notice her at first. She watched the way he listened more than he spoke, his manner unhurried despite the bustle around him. When he did turn, his eyes found hers without hesitation. He tipped his hat, a small acknowledgment that somehow carried across the space between them. By the time she stepped outside, he'd finished with the blacksmith and was leaning against the rail, one boot propped on the lower rung. "Miss Whitford," he said, "Cedar Bluff treating you fair?" "Well enough," she replied. "Work keeps me busy." "That's better than the other way around." His gaze flicked to the parcels in her arms. "You walking all that back to the house?" "It's not far." "I'll carry the heavier ones," he said, already taking the sack of flour before she could answer. They fell into step along Main Street. It wasn't a long walk, but Clara noticed the small things. How he shifted the weight of the sack so it didn't jar with each stride. How he slowed when a wagon passed so they wouldn't be splashed by the muddy ruts. At the porch of Carraway House, he set the flour down on the top step. "Thank you," she said, her tone formal but sincere. Elias touched the brim of his hat again. "If you've got a free hour some afternoon, I know a stretch of land west of town where the grass runs higher than your knees. Worth the walk." She studied him for a beat. "I might," she said. "Then I'll see you around." He didn't wait for her to promise, just turned, mounted his horse, and rode down the street at the same easy pace he seemed to do everything. Inside, Mrs. Carraway was at the front desk, going over the ledger. Her eyes flicked from Clara to the step outside, then back again. "Mr. Boone's decent folk," she said, without looking up from the page. "Quiet. Keeps to himself." "That's so," Clara replied, setting the flour on the counter. "Don't mean he's not worth knowing," the older woman added, almost as an afterthought. Clara didn't answer. She went upstairs to put away the thread and oil, but the image of the open prairie Elias had described lingered in her mind. Grass higher than her knees, the wind moving over it in long, slow waves.
That night, as she blew out her lamp, she wondered if she might take that walk sooner rather than later. The invitation came a week later, in the same understated way Elias seemed to do everything. It was late afternoon, and Clara had just stepped out of the back door of Caraway House after hanging the last of the linens to dry. He found him leaning against the fence by the alley, hat tipped low, a coil of twine hooked on his thumb. "Miss Whitford," he said, straightening, "you've still got that free hour." She glanced toward the laundry line. The breeze was light, the sheets already beginning to ripple and dry. "I suppose I do." They walked west, away from the noise of Main Street, past the blacksmith's yard and the small schoolhouse where a bell rope hung limp in the afternoon air. Once clear of the last buildings, the land opened in front of them, rolling toward the horizon. The grass was thick and high, just as he'd promised, bending in soft waves under the steady wind. They followed a wagon track until it narrowed to little more than a trail, their steps falling in unhurried rhythm. For a time, neither spoke. "I used to think starting over meant leaving everything behind," Clara said at last, watching the wind comb the tops of the grass. "Like I could just step into a new place and be someone else entirely." "And now?" he asked. "Now I'm not so sure it works that way. Maybe starting over means carrying what you've been through, just finding a better way to bear it." Elias kept his eyes on the horizon. "I can see that." They walked another dozen paces before she spoke again. "You've been in Cedar Bluff long?" "Long enough," he said. "Bought a patch of land a few miles out. Keeps me occupied." "Why stay here?" He gave a small shrug. "Some places fit. Don't need explaining. They just hold what you've carried, same as you said." She glanced at him then, studying the easy way he moved beside her, the lack of hurry in his stride. "And you? You carry much?" "Some," he said simply. "Same as anyone worth talking to." They reached a low rise where the grass thinned, giving way to bare earth scattered with wild sage. From there, the view stretched unbroken, the late-day sun spilling gold across the prairie. Clara drew a slow breath. "It's quiet here. That's why I like it." She stood a long moment, letting the silence settle. Then, almost without thinking, she said, "I'm not looking for saving, Mr. Boone." His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. "I'm not offering it." The wind moved between them, carrying the scent of sage and the faint rattle of dry seed heads. They turned back toward town as the sun dipped lower. The walk was slower this time, the space between their words filled with something unspoken but not unwelcome. When they reached the edge of Cedar Bluff, Elias paused. "I'll be mending a fence out at my place next week," he said. "It's slow work, but the view's good. You're welcome to come by." She gave a single nod. "I might take you up on that." He tipped his hat, and she watched him go, his figure shrinking against the wide backdrop of the prairie until he turned down a side street and was gone. That night, as she folded the last of the dry linens, Clara found herself thinking less about the work she'd done and more of the long stretch of grass outside town, and the man who had walked beside her through it without asking her to be anyone but herself. The morning she set out for Elias Boone's place, the sky was a pale, washed blue, the kind that promised a warm day without the weight of summer heat. Clara had wrapped bread and a wedge of cheese in cloth, tucking it into her satchel before leaving the boarding house. Mrs. Caraway didn't ask where she was going. She simply looked up from her ledger and gave a single nod, as if to say, "You've earned the time." Elias was waiting by his gate, leaning on the top rail. The pasture beyond stretched toward the bluff, dotted with a handful of cattle grazing with their heads down. He lifted a hand in greeting as she approached. "Brought lunch," she said, holding up the bundle. "Good," he replied. "We'll work for it." The fence in question ran along the south edge of his land, a line of weathered posts with wire sagging between them. A section had been broken clean through, the ends of the boards splintered.
"Looks like something heavy came through," Clara said, kneeling to touch the cracked wood. "Likely an elk," Elias replied, uncoiling fresh wire from a spool. "They'll push right through if they want what's on the other side." He handed her a pair of gloves and showed her where to hold the post steady while he hammered new staples into place. They fell into an easy rhythm. He measured and cut, she held and braced. The sound of hammer on wood carried across the open field, the steady thock broken now and then by the call of a meadowlark. They worked without hurry. When he paused to fetch another length of wire, Clara took the canteen from his saddle and drank, the water cool and metallic. She passed it to him when he returned, their fingers brushing briefly. By midday they'd mended the break and shored up 2 leaning posts. They found a patch of shade beneath a cottonwood and sat on the grass to eat. For a while the only sounds were the wind in the leaves and the low chewing of cattle. Then Elias reached into his coat and pulled out a small tin. Inside were 3 coins, a broken button, and a folded scrap of paper, the edges gone soft from handling. "This was my brother's," he said quietly. Clara looked at him. "You had a brother?" He nodded. "Older by 3 years. We drove cattle together down to Abilene. He took fever on the trail, didn't last more than a week." He handed her the paper. The ink was faded, but the writing was careful. "Buy land. Build a house with windows that open. Don't die unknown." Clara read the list twice before folding it carefully and giving it back. "Number 3, she said softly. "That's the one that catches." "Yeah," Elias agreed. "Not afraid of dying, just afraid of going without someone knowing who you were." She rested her elbows on her knees, looking out over the grass. "I think about that too. Not dying, but being forgotten." Elias slipped the paper back into the tin. "I won't forget you, Clara." The words were plain, without flourish, but they held a weight she could feel. She didn't answer, only met his gaze for a long moment before looking back to the pasture. They finished their bread in silence. When they rose to head back toward the cabin, she felt the steady pull of something taking root. Not hurried, not forced, but as real as the posts they'd just set into the earth. The ride back toward Elias's cabin was slow, the horse picking its way over uneven ground softened by spring rains. Clara sat behind him, one hand resting lightly against his side, her satchel of empty cloth wraps tucked between them. The sun was high now, pressing warmth into her shoulders, and the smell of sage drifted up from the low places in the land. They didn't speak for a while, but it wasn't an uneasy silence. Clara found she was starting to recognize this kind, the sort that let thoughts settle instead of chasing them away with words. At the cabin, Elias dismounted first and tied the reins to the post. Clara stepped down without his help this time, her balance sure after weeks of riding short distances. "Coffee?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "If you've got it." Inside, he set the kettle on the stove and spooned grounds into the pot. The smell filled the small room, warm and earthy. Clara moved to the table, brushing a faint layer of dust from the surface before sitting. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked as he poured water over the grounds. "Not in years," Elias said.
"Why?" "Just wonderin' what keeps a man steady in one place." He turned the pot once on the stove before answering. "Some places, they know how to hold what you've carried. No need to keep movin' when you find one like that." She studied him. "And this land holds what you've carried?" He nodded. "Most of it." When the coffee was ready, he poured 2 mugs and set one in front of her. Clara took it in both hands, letting the heat seep into her palms. They drank without hurry. Outside, a hawk wheeled against the bright sky, its shadow sliding over the patch of bare earth near the barn. "I'm not certain I'd know what to do if I stopped running," Clara said quietly. "Then maybe it's worth finding out." She met his eyes for a moment before looking down into her cup. The thought of stopping, truly stopping, was both unsettling and strangely appealing. By late afternoon, the sun had begun its slow drop toward the horizon. Elias saddled the horse again and offered her a ride back to town. At the edge of Cedar Bluff, he reined in near the boarding house gate. Clara didn't dismount right away. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "Don't need to know," Elias said.
"You just have to want to." Her fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the saddle. "I want to." He turned enough to meet her gaze. "Then we'll take it as it comes." She swung down from the horse, her boots hitting the hard-packed dirt. "Next Sunday," she said, "I'll bring more than bread." "I'll be waiting," he replied. She climbed the porch steps without looking back, but when she reached the door, she paused, not from doubt, but from a sense that something had shifted for good. Elias watched her go, then turned the horse toward home. The air was cooling, the sky streaked with the soft pink of evening. In his mind, he could already see the next Sunday. Her voice in the quiet room, the smell of bread on the stove, and the easy kind of silence they were learning to share. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The first frost of autumn came early that year, dusting the grass tips in white and making each breath a thin cloud in the morning air. Clara had walked the 3 miles from Cedar Bluff with her shawl pulled tight, a basket on one arm, and a folded flannel shirt under the other. Elias was outside the cabin when she arrived, mending a small pen where a yearling steer stood chewing lazily. He straightened when he saw her, brushing his gloved hands on his coat. "You're early," he said. "You left before dawn last week," Clara replied. "I thought I'd return the favor." He opened the gate and let her inside. She handed him the folded shirt. "My father's," she said. "I'd like you to have it." Elias unfolded it slowly, his hand smoothing over the worn fabric. "I'll wear it when the snow comes," he said. And there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not surprise, but the weight of being trusted. After breakfast, he took her down a narrow path behind the cabin, one she hadn't noticed before. It led to a clearing bordered by cottonwoods. At the far edge, under a heavy tarp tied with twine, lay a neat stack of milled boards. "I started cutting these last winter," Elias said, pulling back the tarp. "Wasn't sure what for yet." Clara ran her fingers along the edge of one plank, the wood smooth beneath her touch. "You're building something?" "I was thinking of adding to the cabin," he said. "Room enough for 2, or more, if the Lord sees fit." She turned toward him, her breath catching slightly in the cold air. "You're sure about that?" "I'm not guessing, Clara. I don't want you walking back to town every Sunday. I want you to stay, if you want that too." For a moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. Her eyes swept the clearing, the boards stacked like a promise, the land that seemed to match the quiet she'd begun to carry inside herself. "I want a life with my hands in the soil," she said slowly. "I want to wake knowing the day's mine to shape. I want to belong somewhere again." "You belong here," Elias said. She stepped closer, fingers brushing the collar of his coat. "Then build it. I'll help." They walked back toward the cabin together, the path winding between the cottonwoods, the boards left neatly covered beneath their tarp. The air had the sharp edge of coming winter, each gust pulling at the hem of Clara's skirt. Inside, Elias stoked the stove and set the coffee pot on. Clara moved to the small window and looked out toward the clearing they'd just left. The milled wood stood in her mind like a promise, solid, unhurried, waiting to be shaped. "I've never stayed anywhere by choice," she said finally, "only because I didn't have the means to leave." Elias glanced up from the stove. "And now?" She didn't turn from the window. "Now I'm thinking about staying because I want to. That's different." He didn't push her for more, just poured the coffee and set a mug on the table. "You've been carrying your life in your own hands for a long time, Clara. Nothing wrong with setting it down in the right place." She crossed the room, taking the mug between both palms. "I don't know if I'll ever stop feeling like I might have to run again."
"If that day comes," he said, "we'll face it together. But I won't let the thought of it keep us from building something now." She sat, the wood of the chair warm from the fire. Outside, a gust rattled the shutters, and she thought of the countless towns she'd passed through, the faces she'd never see again. None of them had offered her a reason to stay, until now. Elias sat across from her, elbows resting loosely on the table. There was no demand in his gaze, no urgency. Only the same steadiness she'd felt the day he helped her down from the stagecoach wreck. She realized, with a kind of quiet surprise, that she trusted it. "I want to help with the building," she said, "from the first post to the last nail." His mouth curved slightly. "Then we'll start before the frost sets in deep." They finished their coffee in silence, but it was the easy kind, the sort that made the walls of the small cabin feel wide as the open prairie. Clara knew the choice she was making would change everything, and for once she wasn't afraid of that. 2 weeks later, the first snowflakes came early, drifting in slow spirals across the yard while Clara and Elias stood side by side at the cabin's workbench. The boards from the clearing had been hauled up, stacked against the wall, their pale surfaces catching the light from the window. Elias measured a length of timber, his pencil marking the cut. Clara held it steady while he sawed, the rasp of blade on wood filling the small space. She'd never done more than mend a fence before, but the work felt right in her hands. "You ever build something from the ground up?" Elias asked. "Not like this," she said. "But I have rebuilt myself enough times to know how to start." He paused, resting his hands on the saw handle. "This time, you don't have to do it alone." She met his eyes, and for a moment the room seemed quieter than the falling snow outside. "I know," she said simply. The days shortened quickly after that. They worked when the light was good, storing each finished beam inside before the cold could warp it. In the evenings they planned where the new wall would go, how the windows would face the morning sun, where to set the table so they could see the bluff in the distance. One night, as they sat with the plans spread across the table, Elias reached into his coat and pulled out a small tin. Inside, the folded scrap of paper with his brother's list still rested, edges worn soft. "Number 3's taken care of," Clara said softly. He smiled faintly. "Not just for me." They sat in the warm lamplight, the air carrying the smell of pine shavings and wood smoke. Clara traced the rough outline of the addition on the paper, her fingertip pausing at the square marked "door." "Once it's built," she said, "I won't be walking back to town after Sunday dinner." "That's the plan," Elias replied. She leaned back in her chair, letting the certainty of it settle deep. For the first time in years, she felt the ground beneath her life steadying like a fence post set firm in the soil. The wedding happened on a gray afternoon in late November, the kind of day when the air smelled of snow, though none had fallen yet. There was no announcement in the Cedar Bluff paper, no gathering of townsfolk, just the way Clara preferred it. Mrs. Ada Carraway stood behind the counter of the mercantile, her dark dress buttoned to the throat, hair pinned in the same no-nonsense knot as always. She had agreed to serve as witness without fuss or sentiment. The preacher, an older man with a soft voice, read the brief vows in the back room, standing beneath a row of drying herbs and a single oil lamp. Elias's bark coat had been brushed clean, and he wore the boots he kept for Sundays. Clara's dress was simple calico, the color of wheat, sewn by her own hand in the evenings after work. When the preacher asked for their promises, neither of them hesitated. There were no long speeches, no flourishes, only the clear exchange of words that would bind their lives together. "I will," Elias said, his voice even but carrying a quiet weight. "I will," Clara answered, steady and certain. Mrs. Carraway signed her name in the small ledger the preacher kept, then looked at Clara with something like pride hiding behind her strict expression. "You've chosen well," she said, though she didn't specify whether she meant the man or the life. They stepped out into the cool air together. A few flurries drifted down from the low clouds, melting as they touched the ground. Elias helped Clara into the saddle, then swung up behind her. The horses' hooves sounded muffled on the damp earth as they left town, heading toward the bluff. By the time they reached the cabin, the first flakes had begun to stick in the grass. Inside, the fire was already laid in the stove, and a pot of stew waited where Clara had left it that morning. They ate quietly, the way they always had. No need for ceremony now that the promises were spoken. Afterward, Elias lit the oil lamp, its warm glow filling the small room. Clara stood beside him at the window, watching the snow gather on the porch rail. "I don't have much," Elias said. "You have this," she replied, leaning into him. He didn't answer, but his arms settled around her, holding her there as the snow began to fall in earnest. Winter settled in slow and deep, blanketing the bluff and pasture under a clean white hush. The days were short, the sun a pale disk that barely cleared the ridge before sinking again. Inside the cabin, life moved at a quieter pace. Clara rose early, stirring the embers in the stove back to life before Elias returned from breaking ice in the water trough. She mended curtains, planted bulbs in clay pots against the windowsill, and kept a loaf of bread rising near the stove. Elias repaired the barn door, built shelves for the kitchen, and carved a shallow dish for her hairpins. They spoke less than most couples, but what needed saying found its way between them in other forms. The way he set her boots close to the fire to warm before she stepped into them. The way she kept his coffee hot without being asked. On Sundays, they rode into town together for church, snow crunching under the horses' hooves. They sat side by side in the small wooden pew, the light from the tall windows falling across their clasped hands. The sermons were simple: gratitude, patience, the Lord's provision, but Clara found herself listening with new ears. The words about steadfastness in all seasons felt like they were meant for her. One night in late February, she woke to find Elias sitting on the edge of the bed, pulling on his boots. "There's a new calf," he whispered, "born just after midnight." Clara smiled in the dim light. "Then spring's coming." "I think it is." They stepped outside together, their breath rising in the cold. The sky was full of stars, the kind of clear that only came after a hard freeze. In the small pen, the calf stood unsteady beside its mother, steam lifting from both in the frigid air. Elias rested a hand lightly against Clara's back, and for a long moment they just watched the new life find its footing. Back inside, with the door latched against the cold, Clara wrapped herself in a quilt and sat by the stove. Elias poured water into the coffee pot, the faint hiss of it on the hot iron the only sound. It wasn't a grand moment, not the kind she'd once thought would mark a life, but in the quiet, in the steady rhythm of their shared work and small joys, Clara felt something she had never known before. Not simply shelter, but a home. By mid-March, the snow began to pull back from the fence lines, leaving narrow seams of damp earth that widened each day. The creek, silent all winter, loosened its voice again, rushing over stones sleek with moss. Clara and Elias walked its edge one afternoon, boots softening in the thawed ground, their hands clasped loosely between them. They paused at a bend where the water slowed into a still pool, the bare branches of the cottonwoods trembling in the breeze. Clara leaned on the rail of the small footbridge, watching the current carry bits of last year's leaves downstream. "Do you ever wonder what your brother would think of all this?" she asked. Elias was quiet for a long moment. "He'd say I found what he wanted." "And what do you say?" "I say I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world." They crossed the bridge and followed the trail toward the rise above the pasture. From there, the cabin was a small square against the land, smoke rising straight from the chimney in the still air. Clara took in the view, the garden's empty beds waiting for seed, the fence line strong and true, the roof patched against the last storms of the season. It struck her how much of their life here had been built with their own hands.
Each board and nail had been set with the same quiet intention they brought to every day. As they walked back, Elias's fingers brushed hers. "You ever think about how much of life is just showing up?" he said. Clara smiled faintly. "And staying." They reached the cabin as the sun dipped low, turning the last snow patches to gold. Inside, Clara set water to boil for tea, while Elias stowed the tools he'd carried from the shed. Later, as dusk settled in and the lamp's glow filled the room, she found herself thinking of that scrap of paper Elias kept in the small tin. 3 lines written years ago, a list that now felt complete. Number 1, buy land. Number 2, build a house with windows that open. Number 3, don't die unknown. She looked across the table at the man who had kept his word to his brother without ever needing to say it out loud. "I think he'd be proud," she said softly. Elias met her eyes, his own steady and warm. "I know I am." If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The years after that first winter passed like a slow river, steady, with only the occasional bend to mark the change in seasons. By the second spring, the garden behind the cabin was heavy with rows of beans, corn, and squash. Clara's hands grew calloused from the hoe and the washboard, but she wore those marks with quiet pride. Elias kept the cattle healthy, the fences sound, and the roof tight against storms. In their 3rd year, a boy was born, dark-haired, with the same calm gray eyes as his father. They named him Thomas. 2 years later, a daughter followed, Anna, quick to laugh and quicker to question. The cabin's extra room, built plank by plank from that winter's boards, became the children's space. Life was never without its work.
There were seasons when the grass went dry too soon, when a calf was lost to fever, when a hailstorm shredded the garden in less than an hour. But each trial was met side by side. Some evenings ended with quiet prayers over the table, thanking the Lord not for ease, but for the means to endure. Clara did not often go into Cedar Bluff except for church on Sundays. But when she did, she carried something from the garden or the kitchen. A jar of preserves for the preacher's wife, a loaf of oat bread for the blacksmith's widow. After Mrs. Ada Carraway passed on one summer, the boarding house changed hands, but Clara still visited. She always made her way upstairs to the second-floor rooms, where the girls new to town often stayed. Some barely more than children, their hands raw from washwater, their eyes wary. Clara never offered advice unless asked, but she left small things behind. A jar of salve for chapped skin, a length of ribbon tucked under a pillow, or a paper-wrapped bundle of oatcakes on the windowsill. Thomas learned to mend fence lines before he could read, walking alongside Elias with a coil of wire slung across his shoulder. Anna learned to track a trail through the sage and to knead bread without letting the dough go tough. Both children grew up with the understanding that a day's work was its own reward, and that the truest wealth was in the roof over their heads and the company they kept beneath it. By the time Thomas was 12, he could ride into town alone to fetch supplies, and Anna, at 10, could split kindling faster than her mother. Clara found herself with more moments to breathe, to sit on the porch in the evening and watch the shadows lengthen across the pasture, to listen to the sound of Elias's hammer or the children's laughter drifting on the wind. It was in those quiet moments, with the smell of sage after rain and the cottonwoods murmuring by the creek, that Clara felt the full weight of what they had built. Not just the cabin and the land, but the life that had taken root in them both. One evening, as the sun slipped low behind the bluff, Elias joined her on the porch. He handed her a cup of coffee, still steaming, and sat beside her. "Long day?" he asked. "A good one," she said. "The kind you feel in your bones, but not in a bad way." They sat in easy silence, the sound of crickets beginning in the grass. Clara glanced toward the garden, where the beans hung heavy and the squash vines twisted in green knots. "It's strange," she said after a while.
How something can start so small, a ride in the rain, a single room, and grow into all this. Elias smiled, his gaze on the horizon. Small things have a way of lasting, if you tend to them. She leaned into his shoulder, content to let the quiet settle again. In that stillness, she understood that the life they'd made wasn't just survival. It was abundance, the kind measured not in coins, but in the peace earned at the end of each day. The summer Anna turned 12, the rains came early and heavy, greening the pasture so quickly that the cattle grazed belly deep for weeks. Thomas was 17 by then, taller than his father, already talking about taking a herd east in the fall. The cabin had grown too. A lean-to shed stood beside the barn, and a small smokehouse waited behind the garden. Inside, the walls bore the marks of years. A line of pencil marks by the door where the children's heights had been measured. A faint scuff on the floor from the winter Elias had built the second bedstead. One late August evening, Clara set a pot of stew on the stove while Elias sharpened his tools outside. The children were in the garden pulling onions, their voices carrying in bursts through the open window. The air smelled of earth and wood smoke, with just a hint of sage from the bluff. When the table was set and the bread sliced, they all bowed their heads. Elias gave thanks, his words as plain as always. Lord, for this food, for this roof, and for these hands to share it, we're grateful. After supper, the children cleared the table, and Clara stepped onto the porch with her coffee. The sun was sliding behind the ridge, the light turning everything gold. The grass, the fence posts, even the steam lifting from her cup. Elias joined her, lowering himself into the chair beside hers. "Feels like we just got here," he said, "and like we've been here forever." Clara smiled. Both can be true. They sat in quiet for a while, watching as the first stars appeared above the bluff. Somewhere down by the creek, a night bird called, its voice rising and falling like a slow tide. "I used to think home was just a roof over your head," Clara said. "Now I know better." Elias glanced at her. "What is it then?" "It's a place where you can set down what you've been carrying and know it'll still be here in the morning. And it's the people who keep it standing, no matter the weather." He reached for her hand, his palm warm against hers. "Then we've done all right." She squeezed his fingers lightly. "We have." The door creaked open, and Anna stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. "Ma, Pa, we're going to walk down to the creek before it's full dark." "Stay where we can hear you," Elias said, and Anna nodded before disappearing back inside to fetch Thomas. When the children's footsteps faded, Clara leaned back in her chair, her hand still in Elias's. The lamplight from inside spilled through the open doorway, casting a warm glow on the porch boards. "I think about that day on the road sometimes," she said, "when the coach wheel broke." Elias's mouth curved into the faintest smile. "So do I. You didn't say much then." "I didn't need to. You looked me square and decided for yourself." She laughed softly. "I suppose I did." The breeze shifted, carrying the smell of water from the creek and the faint laughter of their children somewhere in the darkening grass. Elias stood, still holding her hand, and pulled her gently to her feet. "Come on," he said. "Let's see if the stars are out over the pasture yet." They stepped down into the yard, the grass cool under their boots. Above them, the sky deepened into a vast, clear black, the stars bright and steady. Clara tilted her head back, the same way she had the night she first arrived in Cedar Bluff. But now there was no restlessness in her chest, no wondering where the road might take her next. She had already arrived. And in the quiet night, with Elias beside her and the home they'd built standing solid against the bluff, she knew she would stay, for all the seasons still to come. Some stories are built from gun smoke and gold dust. Others, like this one, are stitched from smaller threads, the kind you can only see when you stand still long enough to notice them.
Clara and Elias's life was never about grand gestures. It was about showing up each day, tending the land, raising a family, and keeping faith when the wind turned cold. For those who still remember, this is the heartbeat of the frontier, not just survival, but belonging. It's the quiet triumphs, the hand you hold through the years, and the home you shape together. If tales like this stir something in you, a memory of your own kin, a longing for simpler days, then keep riding with us. Subscribe and join the circle as we share more true Wild West stories where grit meets grace and the past still speaks to the heart.